In legal science, there is a term known as adverse possession. It is a doctrine where a stranger moves onto your land, plants their roots deep enough, builds a fence, and rightfully claims the property as their own through the sheer silence and tolerance of the law. It is a slow deprivation, eroding every inch of your boundaries until the true owner is pushed entirely out of their own kingdom. But in macroeconomics, there is something far more brutal, swift, and bloody. A liquidity crisis. It is the exact moment a colossal empire, one boasting glass-clad skyscrapers, perfectly manicured velvet lawns, and century-old wine cellars, wakes up to realize they cannot scrape together a few $1,000 in cash to keep the machine's heart beating. On paper, they are gods. But in the reality of cash flow, that billion-dollar portfolio is just a dried-up corpse. And to survive, to stop the rot from spreading, they are forced to pick up a knife and start amputating and selling off their own limbs. Sometimes, they'll even sell the memories of the dead. The conference room on the 60th floor of Mackenzie & Partners was flooded with sterile fluorescent lighting. It was a cold, shadowless glare, identical to the surgical lights in an ICU. The smell of burnt espresso from a high-end machine mixed with cheap pine air freshener, creating a thick, suffocating atmosphere. Marcus sat swallowed by a white calfskin chair, his dark plaid flannel shirt, frayed at the elbows, violently contrasted with the soulless perfection of the room. Under the worn-out heel of his steel-toed boot, a chunk of dried mud from yesterday's job site crumbled onto a hand-woven Persian rug worth 1.5 years of a contractor's salary. Marcus didn't bother brushing it away. His mind was currently frozen in an alternate dimension. The steady beep of the heart monitor, the acrid scent of antiseptic, and the cold, abrasive touch of Sarah's hand as her circulatory system stopped pumping blood. All of it still clung to his lungs, refusing to let go. Sarah had been gone for 21 days. 3 weeks. Just enough time for the blood in a dead person's veins to stop coagulating, but not enough time for the first layer of dust to settle on their wedding photo above the fireplace. Across the 20-foot tempered glass table, Margaret Wellington's, his mother-in-law, sat with her legs crossed. She didn't spare him a single glance. Her eyes were glued to her iPad Pro, where the red candlestick charts of Wellington's holding stock were in a freefall. Beneath her flawless Charlotte Tilbury foundation, the skin around her eyes was gray and sagging. The bottom of the water glass in front of her had been dry for half an hour. But Margaret absent-mindedly picked it up anyway, pressing the rim to her chapped lips, desperately seeking a drop of moisture to soothe a throat choked tight by the crushing weight of debt. She spoke with a raspy tone, exhausted but desperately trying to maintain her authority. Escrow closed at 10 this morning. Marcus stopped rubbing his calloused thumb over the worn joint of his index finger. The only movement indicating he was still breathing ceased entirely. Margaret stared dead at her screen, her voice flat and hollow. The house went to a couple of surgeons transferring from the East Coast. Closing price was $3.2 million, cash, paid in full, no mortgage. The air in the room thinned. Marcus's chest barely rose. He forced the words out, heavy and desperate. That is my house. Margaret locked the iPad screen and tossed it onto the glass table. A harsh clack echoed out, fracturing the panic she was trying to hide beneath her veneer of power. She let out a dry, condescending scoff. Wrong, builder. Her voice hardened, speeding up slightly with defensive aggression. It is real estate managed by the Wellingtons Family Trust. My daughter had the right to occupy it while she was breathing. Now, she is not. She leaned in, her words sharp, cold, and threatening. And as the sole trustee, I have absolute authority to liquidate the asset. You have 48 hours, starting this minute, to pack up your rusty tools and clear your trash out of the garage. Losing a fraction of her composure, she raised her voice. After 48 hours, I am calling the sheriff. Marcus intertwined his fingers, gripping them together so tightly, his knuckles turned stark white under his sun-baked skin. He looked at his mother-in-law. She wasn't savoring the victory of class warfare. 3 years ago, Margaret would have sneered and thrown in a few insults about his blue-collar roots, but today there was no arrogance. Her darting eyes, her erratic breathing, and her exhausted hand running through her hair betrayed a naked truth. She was bleeding out. That suburban house where he and Sarah had poured the foundation and nailed every shingle to the roof was now just a final oxygen tank, an emergency blood bag for Margaret to pump into the family's hemorrhaging cash flow. Margaret stood up abruptly, shifting the lapels of her beige trench coat. She didn't have time to stick around and relish her son-in-law's humiliation. This afternoon, 2 margin calls from Wall Street were hovering over her head, waiting to drop and tear her father's empire to shreds. $3.2 million in cash from that house was her only life raft. Her Louboutin heels clicked frantically toward the door. The class hierarchy had reasserted itself. Phew, the dreamer had been exiled from the kingdom. Marcus dropped his chin to his chest and squeezed his eyes shut. In the sterile silence of the law firm, he could almost hear the load-bearing walls inside his own soul cracking. In structural engineering, latent defect is defined as capillary cracks buried deep inside a concrete core. They are invisible to appraisals, hiding beneath the most flawless coats of paint, undetectable to the naked eye or surface ultrasound. A latent defect doesn't bring a building down immediately. It is remarkably patient. It waits for decades, silently absorbing the Earth's microtremors and accumulating the stress of gravity, until one day, the entire magnificent structure collapses over a passing breeze. Sarah's bone marrow cancer was a physical latent defect. No one knew when it started, and it wasn't until the agonizing pain began tearing through her spine that the building of her life signaled its collapse. But Margaret Wellington's bottomless greed and administrative rot was the latent defect of an entire dynasty. The skies over the Chicago suburbs were an oppressive, overcast gray that afternoon. There was no sun, only blood-red, coagulated streaks of dusk, bleeding through the clouds and spilling onto the wet asphalt. Marcus pulled his Ford F-150 onto the familiar gravel driveway. The tires crushed the loose stone with a dry, crunching sound. The sold sign from Century 21 had been jammed violently into the manicured velvet lawn. The wooden stake had dug up a jagged, ugly chunk of mud. From a distance, it looked exactly like a hastily erected tombstone, an open wound on the earth. The order from the trust had been executed. The house had returned to a static state, preparing to welcome new parasites to erase all traces of the old ones. Marcus killed the engine. The mechanical growl died instantly, leaving behind a suffocating silence. He stepped out into the thin mist and put his key in the lock. The oak door swung open. He didn't hit the lights. The shadows of dusk flooded the living room. Marcus quietly bent down, unlaced his mud-caked steel-toed boots, and peeled off his frayed gray wool socks. His bare feet stepped directly onto the hardwood floor. Immediately, the radiant heat from beneath the floorboards traveled up his heels, caressing the creases in his skin. It felt exactly like a familiar touch, her warmth. He had designed and installed this heating system himself during their second winter together, because Sarah was always complaining about cold feet. Now, the hot water was still quietly circulating through the copper piping beneath the wood, sustaining artificial life in a dead space. Marcus walked slowly through the living room. Everything was exactly where it belonged, holding onto the ghost of its owner like fossilized shadows. A half-knitted wool blanket was draped over the arm of the armchair. A dog-eared novel lay face down on the coffee table, next to a ceramic mug stained with dried chamomile tea. Sarah's signature scent of dried lavender lingered in the air, mixing with the fine dust of abandonment. He stopped in front of the solid river rock fireplace. His eyes dropped to the left corner of the floor, tucked just under the edge of the area rug. There was a single floorboard there, one shade darker than the rest. It was the rotted board he had replaced the night Sarah got her first biopsy results 4 years ago. That night, she had collapsed in this very corner, crying until she threw up. Marcus had used replacing the floorboard as an excuse to sit next to her, using the sound of a hammer and nails to drown out the helplessness of a man who couldn't take away his wife's physical pain. Marcus dropped to his knees. He reached into the pocket of his faded jeans and pulled out a tempered steel pry bar. He didn't hesitate. He slipped the thin blade into the seam between the wood, a slight flick of his muscular arm. The rusty nails shrieked against the wood grain, echoing through the empty house, as sharp as a scream. The board popped up, kicking up a thin cloud of dust. Gasp. In the dark hollow space below, scattered with 4-year-old sawdust, there were no heating pipes. Nestled in the darkness was a bronze cigar box. Marcus reached in and pulled it out. The bronze had oxidized, blooming with patchy green patina. The box weighed significantly more than its size suggested. It was dense. It held a mass far heavier than typical keepsakes. Marcus ran his thumb over the lid and unlatched the brass clasp. The old hinge let out a dry clack, splitting the silence of the dying afternoon. When a woman knows she is going to die, what does she leave under the floorboards? Romantics would think of tear-stained love letters. Pragmatists would imagine jewelry, gold bars, or a secret bank account. But Sarah Wellington's was neither. She carried the blood of Wall Street wolves, even if she kept it hidden beneath a gentle smile and floral linen dresses. Inside the bronze box, there wasn't a single yellowed photograph. Tucked perfectly inside was a dog-eared black sheepskin notebook and a cold steel-cased waterproof USB drive. Marcus carefully lifted the notebook. He opened the first page. The smell of old black ink hit his nose, carrying the sharp coldness of a mathematical mind. What crossed his retinas were not agonizing journal entries about cancer pain. The pages were crammed with hand-drawn diagrams, intertwining cash flow charts and organizational trees of Wellington's holdings, drawn in black ink. Every arrow, every annotation was written with a handwriting that was soft, yet pressed so firmly it embossed the next page. Marcus was a builder. He had spent his entire life reading the most complex blueprints, from load-bearing beam layouts to underground electrical grids. And the eye of a builder quickly recognized the architecture of a collapse mapped out on these pages. This was the blueprint of the Wellington's empire's plumbing system. But instead of water, it was pumping blood. Tens of millions of dollars were being desperately siphoned off. Over the last 3 years, while Sarah was battling the chemo that was making her blonde hair fall out in clumps, Margaret had been quietly performing a ruthless financial autopsy. She had been gutting the family trust, the trust of which Sarah was the sole legal beneficiary, to patch up the fatal wounds caused by her own catastrophic commercial real estate investments. Page 4 spelled it out. November last year, $15 million, diverted from the Educational Investment Fund to Shell Corp Beta in the Cayman Islands. Page 7. February this year, $22 million. Fraudulent mortgage on the medical complex to roll over an unsecured corporate loan. Grand total, $72 million. All of it belonged to Sarah's inheritance, embezzled by her own mother to keep her chairman's seat from flipping. Marcus's jaw clenched, his temple muscles twitched violently. He flipped rapidly through the pages. 4 years. The date written in the corner of the very first page was 4 years ago. She had started preparing for this war 4 years ago, long before the first rounds of chemo drained her life force, long before Margaret started openly treating her son-in-law like garbage. Marcus suddenly remembered those late winter nights, when he would wake up to find Sarah hunched over her desk under a sickly yellow light, coughing violently, her trembling hands clicking away at the keyboard. He had assumed she was keeping a diary or researching alternative treatments. He had brought her hot milk, kissed her forehead, and watched with a breaking heart as she withered away day by day. But no, inside that frail skin and bones frame was a tactical mind as cold as ice. Sarah wasn't a sacrificial lamb waiting to die on a hospital bed. She was an architect quietly redrawing the map of the kingdom. She knew her mother would bleed the trust dry. She knew Margaret would throw Marcus out on the street the second she closed her eyes. And the $3.2 million from the sale of this suburban house today was the very last brick Margaret had pulled from the foundation to patch the roof. Pure, unadulterated desperation. Taped securely to the final pages of the notebook was a printed legal document, highlighted in bright yellow. It was a certified excerpt of Clause 4, Section B, from the original will of the first Wellingtons, Sarah's grandfather, the man who built this empire from the ashes of the Great Depression. Marcus held his breath, sweeping his eyes over the razor-sharp legalese. Failsafe clause. Power of appointment and removal of trustee. In the event the trustee is proven to have engaged in self-dealing, embezzlement, or a severe breach of fiduciary duty resulting in the depletion of assets, absolute control of the trust shall immediately be revoked and transferred unconditionally to the next beneficiary in line. In the event of the sole beneficiary's passing, this supreme authority automatically passes to the surviving legal spouse. It felt as if an invisible hand crushed Marcus's lungs, cutting off his air. Gasp. He stared down at the steel-cased USB drive lying dormant at the bottom of the box. What was inside a piece of metal the size of his thumb? Encrypted bank statements, notarized documents from Cayman shell companies, forged signatures. The entire indictment file, perfectly indexed and categorized. Sarah didn't leave him a tear-soaked goodbye letter to comfort his soul. That kind of softness wouldn't protect him from a pack of wolves. She left him a heavy artillery legal arsenal. She had personally stripped the drywall off the latent defects of the Wellingtons tower, and handed him the blueprints pinpointing exactly where the load-bearing columns were weakest. Marcus turned to the back of the last page. Under the fading light of the shadows swallowing the room, a slanted, handwritten note appeared. The ink was pressed so hard it tore the parchment, proof that the writer had used every last ounce of their failing strength to drive the pen. A building rotting from the core cannot be repaired, Marcus. It can only be imploded. The keys to the detonator are in your hands. No I love you, no live a good life. Just a ruthless cutthroat mandate for the transfer of power, overflowing with absolute trust. A single scalding tear broke from Marcus's eye. It dropped straight onto the paper, blurring the black ink on the word imploded. He didn't wipe his face. He pressed his callous thumb over the smeared ink, rubbing it hard, letting the black pigment bleed into his rough skin. He closed the bronze lid. A sharp clack echoed out with finality. Total darkness consumed the house, but inside Marcus's eyes a cold fire had just been lit. The gentle, compliant builder who fixed roofs and laid floorboards died along with that tear. Tonight was over. Tomorrow, when the sun came up, the chief architect of destruction would step into the light. In the demolition of macro-architectural structures, the term implosion is the absolute pinnacle of destructive art. They don't use massive cranes or multi-ton wrecking balls to shatter the glittering glass exterior. Those methods are too loud and too sloppy. With an implosion, Engineers calculate the exact center of gravity of a building, then plant C4 charges directly onto the core load-bearing columns in the subterranean basements. When the detonator is pressed, the glamorous outer shell stands tall, proudly reflecting the sun until the very last millisecond. And then, in the blink of an eye, the entire superstructure collapses. The tower crushes itself under its own weight. Not a single piece of debris flies outside the perimeter. It is a clean, perfect, and self-contained death. 9 a.m. The 45th floor of Wellington's Holdings headquarters, downtown Chicago. The frosted glass hydraulic doors of the boardroom violently swung open. No knock, no secretary announcing his arrival, no lawyers in tow. Marcus walked in. He wasn't wearing a tailored velvet suit. He wasn't wearing a silk tie. He wore his dark plaid flannel, dusted with white cement powder. His steel-toed boots slammed against the Italian marble floor with a heavy, deafening rhythm. His presence was a calculated desecration of a space reeking of Tom Ford cologne, expensive cigars, and the suffocating fear of white-collar executives. Margaret Wellingtons was standing at the solid oak podium at the head of the table. She held a laser pointer, the red dot aimed at the Q3 cash flow projections on the massive screen. Cold sweat beaded on her forehead. The moment she saw Marcus, her voice hitched mid-sentence. Her bloodshot eyes, webbed with red veins from severe sleep deprivation, blew wide open with panic and darted toward the door. Margaret shrieked, her voice thin, shattered, and shrill. "Gasp, call lobby security right now. Who let this contractor up here?" 8 board members snapped their heads around. The Rolexes and Patek Philippes on their wrists caught the light. Marcus didn't answer. He walked straight to the head of the table, his towering frame completely eclipsing Margaret. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the steel-cased USB drive and a thick stack of papers, the copy of the first's will alongside Sarah's diagrams. He slammed them down onto the mahogany table. The dry, ironclad sound made all 8 directors flinch simultaneously, their shoulders shrinking as if bracing for a gunshot. Marcus began. His tone was dead flat, completely still, and absolutely freezing, devoid of any vibration of anger or vengeance. It was the voice of a judge reading a death sentence. The concept of breach of fiduciary duty, gentlemen, is when a fund manager uses the blood money of the dead to patch up their own incompetence and greed while living. Margaret froze. The muscles in her face spasmed. The laser pointer slipped from her trembling fingers, hit the podium with a clatter, and rolled off onto the carpet. The red dot danced erratically across the ceiling. Marcus planted both hands on the edge of the table and slowly leaned forward. He swept his eyes, as sharp as broken glass, across every single breathless white-collar face. Sweat began to form on the CFO's forehead. $72 million. Siphoned from the Wellingtons Family Trust into 3 shell companies based in the Cayman Islands over the last 24 months. Marcus lifted a finger and tapped the metal USB drive twice. Every transaction record, dummy contract, and digital signature is inside this block of steel, and according to Clause 4, Section B of the Founder's Will, the second this embezzlement is proven with legal evidence, Margaret Wellingtons is officially stripped of her administrative power. Marcus shifted his gaze directly to Margaret. Absolute control over the trust's massive assets, including the 51% controlling stake of the very company you are sitting in right now, automatically transfers to me, Sarah Wellington's sole legal heir. All the oxygen was sucked out of the room. The AC was still blasting cold air, but 8 men in tailored suits suddenly found it hard to breathe. Money never has loyalty. Money only understands gravity. Wherever the mass is, the pull follows. And right now, 51% of the equity's gravity was crushing Margaret into the floor, stealing the air right out of her lungs. The collapse of a tower always starts from within. She stumbled back a step. Her stiletto heel caught the edge of the rug, and she nearly went down. The proud armor of the Iron Lady was ripped apart, shattered into 100 pieces. Standing there was nothing more than a shivering thief at the defendant's table, stripped of all the makeup of her deceit. Her ruthlessness when selling his house yesterday didn't come from a place of power. It came from the sheer, blinding panic of a drowning woman clutching at foam to survive. Margaret whispered, her throat producing a shredded sound like tearing fabric. "Ugh, you, that bitch Sarah, she hid it from me." Marcus stood up straight, cutting her off with an octave that froze blood. "Don't you ever say my wife's name with that mouth again. You sold her house for $3 million in cash, hoping it would bail you out of this morning's margin call, but your math was off. The foundation of this building has been flooded with salt water for years. A plastic bucket can't bail out the ocean." Marcus picked up the bronze cigar box, holding it securely in the palm of his hand. "I can overnight this USB to the IRS and the SEC right now. This building will officially implode within a week. The stock will be worthless paper, and you will be wearing a prison jumpsuit." Marcus slipped one hand into his pocket, staring dead into Margaret's pupils. "Or, you leave your keycard, you leave the company car keys, and you walk out those doors this exact second. And forever, you will never set foot on a single square foot of real estate bearing the name Wellingtons. I am taking back the company, and I am taking back my house." 8 pairs of eyes around the table simultaneously shifted to Margaret. Not a single man stood up to defend her. Not one offered protection. They were already amputating themselves from the necrotic tissue, preparing to bow to the new king to keep their leather chairs. Margaret looked around, desperate, alone, broken. She opened her mouth, but no words could form in her bone-dry throat. Her manicured, trembling hand reached to her lapel, unclipped her gold-plated executive keycard, and placed it softly on the table. Not a single curse was uttered, no final act of defiance. The woman who once commanded storms picked up her Birkin bag and staggered toward the glass doors. A gray, shriveled shadow, swallowed whole by the sterile hallway of the tower. The hydraulic door hissed softly and slammed shut, locking the remnants of a decayed empire outside. Absolute silence commanded the boardroom. Marcus slowly pulled out the leather chairman's seat at the center of the table. He sat down, his back pressed against the cold leather. The scent of dried lavender seemed to suddenly drift past his nose, lingering in the air, completely wiping out the cold smell of leather in the room. This Wellington's empire wasn't built on bricks and mortar, nor was it sustained by the cruelty of money. It had just been reshaped, resurrected by the quiet brilliance and absolute love of a woman lying deep beneath the earth. Marcus opened Sarah's sheepskin notebook, smoothing her detailed blueprints flat onto the table. His eyes swept over the 8 men, sitting with their heads bowed, waiting for orders. The voice of the new ruler echoed out, sharp and undeniable. "Phew, all right. We start pouring the foundation from scratch.